Today we have Sam Fischer. Is the Senior Data and Analytics Consultant for, let me quickly get the company name. He's also the founder of Apex Insights. Many of us already know Apex Insights. And if you have searched for some things online, you've gone through, if you're the kind of person like me who likes reading a lot of things around Power BI, it's not going to be something rare for you to have come across his own tips he shares and things he shares about Excel. So he's the Senior Data and Analytics Consultant for Revinite. I wanted to pronounce it, but I wanted to see it clearly. So he's going to be sharing with us on a very, very interesting topic, which is on advanced cohort analysis techniques with Power BI. So for those of us who we have always been wanting to see how best to understand our usage, our customers, their behavior, the usage pattern, and some other things that are not always easy to get from the normal day-to-day, just reactive reporting. So you're going to be really excited that you can do some of those things, the cohort analysis, the things that involve a bit more strategic analysis of your user base and customers in Power BI. So I'm going to hand over to him right now. He's okay with you asking your questions as you come upon the questions. So you put them in the chat box or raise your hand, and somehow I will find some moments in between this session to draw his attention to your questions. So Sam, it's a pleasure to have you, and the stage is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Michael. I'll just quickly share my screen and then we can get into it. All right, so is that coming up for everyone now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so again, thanks to Michael for setting this up and allowing this session to happen. And I'm very glad to be here to talk about advanced cohort analysis and customer analysis techniques in Power BI. I'm also very happy that we're able to do this particular hour, because as I understand, you guys usually run these sessions close to the evening time for you guys. Unfortunately, that worked out to be the middle of the night here. So I'm very much appreciative of the fact that I get to have my beauty sleep tonight. So thanks for that as well. So anyway, so a little bit about me. So my name's Sam Fischer. I am a self-described Power BI guru based out of Melbourne, Australia. And as Michael mentioned as well, I'm a senior data and analytics consultant at Revinite. And Revinite's a Melbourne-based consultancy. We work with many different businesses to help them reach a level of data maturity. And we do that with various offerings such as advisory services, helping them establish data governance processes, and then also establishing core reporting within Power BI, and then also various other things to support the data journey as well. As far as qualifications, I'm a Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate. I think that one's now been updated to the Data Analyst Associate, so I need to get around to taking the new exam for that as well. And I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer, so I've ran various different bespoke training sessions at many different clients across many different industries. It's a very kind of fun thing to be involved in from my end as well. And as Michael also mentioned, I run a blog, Apex Insights, that covers various different Power BI tips and tricks. So I've got a few articles up there more recently focused on calculation groups with some more on the pipeline, and then various other topics covered there within the Power BI ecosystem as well. So please check that out and see if there's any content up there that that you might enjoy. So for today's talk, what we'll be covering is a little bit of an overview of the customer analytics field and what's the value that you can bring by using some of these kinds of techniques, such as cohort analysis, which will be a big feature of the talk. And we'll do all this by going through a case study. So we'll start by getting familiar with our data set and seeing what are the features that we have at our disposal. And then from this case study, we'll be able to use some of the analysis techniques that we'll be discussing to understand our customers and really understand their behavior under the hood, as opposed to just the usual simple visuals that we're looking at. We're going to dig into this and understand our customers even better than we typically would be able to. And then I'll also walk you all through how you can actually build these kinds of visuals out for yourselves. So that'll be a really fun thing for all of you guys that are very interested in learning some of those cool DAX techniques. All right, so a starting point that I like to think of when we try to understand what is customer analytics is to start with the relationship between a customer and a business. So typically a customer will come to a business when they have a need that they need to be fulfilled, and that's usually with the business by providing some kind of good or service. So the business will provide that good or service to the customer, and the customer will provide something back to the business that has value. Now, typically that will be money, they'll be paying for that good or service, but there are other ways that business may be able to provide value, or that customer may be able to provide value to that business. So one of which, if you're talking about a more advertising-based business model, they may be more interested in just having your attention. So the fact that no one, as far as I'm aware of, pays for Facebook. Facebook is a free service, but what you're doing is instead of paying money for that service, you're paying your attention to the service, and that generates ad revenue for the business. But what's most important from the perspective of customer analytics is that in addition to providing those kinds of things, you're also providing that company with data. So if we think of, say, a retail business, whenever you make a transaction, you're giving them not only money concerned with that transaction, but you're also giving them data and information about it. So usually you're giving them information about the when of the situation. So when you made the purchase, what time of day, time of year, that kind of thing, where you made the purchase, if it's online, where you're getting your item shipped to, or if it's a brick and mortar store, where the actual store is based. You'll be providing information about who's actually making the purchase. So you may often need to provide information like your name, your address, your phone number, maybe your date of birth as well. And there's other information that you might be providing as well, such as if you're a member of particular loyalty programs. So all this information in a single transaction, it doesn't give you a heap of insight, but because these businesses are able to compile that information for their hundreds of thousands or millions of transactions that they're having every year, then that data does provide a lot more value when it's delivered at scale to them. So once these organizations have this data, what they can do with it, well, they can compile that and aggregate that data to understand collectively how their customers behave. So they might want to group or segment their customers to work out common trends. So you might be able to group customers based on age groups, based on geography, based on spending habits, various different ways you can cut your customer base into different groups. And then you can work out how you can provide offerings to each of those groups individually. So you may choose to provide, say, discounts to those customers. And typically, if you want to bring someone's attention to discounts that they may be available to them, you may need to, for example, send them out an email. And every email that you send may cost you some small amount of money. So what you would be aiming to do is send out that discount to the people who are most likely to uptake that discount. So, for example, if you've got a discount on particular products, say products that are best suited for new mothers, then if you can identify those new mothers in your customer base based on their spending habits or based on other factors that you may be able to report on, then you can offer those discounts just to those customers and not spend money on delivering that the emails about those discounts to customers who it's not going to be relevant to. So that can be a good cost saving, and that can also mean that even though you're losing a bit of money on the individual discount, because many people are taking that up, you're going to be making more money overall. And then once you have those kinds of offerings available to your customers and they're made available in a kind of bespoke, unique way, or at least it's tailored to the customer and their interests, then you'll ultimately improve your customers' opinion of the business, of the organization. They're more likely to stick with them in the long term. They may have an improved customer lifetime value, as is often described within this space. And it means that over time, you'll be able to increase your company's revenue in the long run because you're able to foster those positive relationships with your customers by giving them the offerings that are actually relevant to them. And now I'll also add that some of the techniques that we'll be talking about today, while they do often become branded under customer analytics, they can apply to other areas as well where you don't have conventional customers. So as a bit of an example, before my current role, I used to work with the Australian Red Cross Blood Service, and this is the organisation that runs all the blood donation blood banks across Australia. And because the way that we run blood donation in Australia, it's voluntary, it's not paid. All of our customers aren't actually customers, they're really donors. They're not paid for what they do, but they do come in on a regular basis. And because we have so many of them, we have hundreds of thousands of donors, we can actually apply a lot of these similar techniques to understand, okay, which donors are dropping off the radar and not coming in as often. Can we support their journey so that they can stick around and want to be involved for as long as we'd like them to be, as long as they'd like to be. So these techniques can be applied in other areas as well. So some of these techniques within customer analytics, I'll just go through some of these briefly now. So the key one we're going to focus on today is cohort analysis. So when we're talking about a cohort, what we're referring to is a group of customers that are usually characterized by some common element to do with time. So in this case, we'll be referring to a cohort as a group of customers that started purchasing from a business in a particular month. And this kind of analysis is really good, not just for conventional customers making purchases, but also for things like subscription-based businesses. So you might want to know for each group of customers, how many of those customers made it through the 30-day free trial? How many of them stuck around to month 1, 2, 3 going forward? How many of them stuck around in the long run? So these kind of analyses are really useful to try and understand what's working about certain promotions that are active at a certain time and which ones aren't, for example. So this is a really useful technique for that. We've also got the technique of looking at customer retention and customer churn. So customer retention being how long your customers are sticking around for, and customer churn being how long does it take before that customer leaves and is no longer a customer, maybe they're taking their business elsewhere. So if we can understand what's really driving that behavior and seeing if we can find correlations between what's causing certain customers to stick around and what's causing others to drop off, then we can apply what's working to the customers that are going to potentially drop off soon, and then give them offerings to make them want to stick around for a bit longer. Now, we've also got spend analysis. So typically when we think about our customers, unfortunately, not all customers are created equal. You may have some customers that are making, very few purchases and they're not spending much when they make those purchases. And you may have other customers where they're spending a lot of money and they're spending that money very regularly with your business. So in order to ensure that you've got a kind of stable customer base, these high revenue customers, they're very important. You want to make sure you're paying a lot of attention to them. And it's not to say that these other customers who aren't contributing as much aren't important, but you ultimately want to make sure that you're paying as much attention as you can to without maximizing your costs. So if you paid every single customer the exact same amount of attention, it's probably not going to work out as well as if you focus your attention on those really important customers that are spending a lot with your business there. So that's where spend analysis is very useful. And spend analysis kind of ties into market segmentation as well. So by market segmentation, we're talking about techniques that you can use to, again, group your customers based on different attributes. And one of the more common ones within marketing is this particular technique called Rfm segmentation. So Rfm standing for recency, frequency, and monetary value. And based on these three features, you can basically categorize each of your customers based on how recently they've bought from you, how frequently they're buying from you, and how much they're spending with you. So once you've got those categorized, you can work out who are your really high revenue loyal customers and who are your more flippant customers who aren't buying very often, who are gonna or may be about to drop off soon. And you can work out how you can prioritize your resources to focus on those loyal customers, for example. So on the topic of Rfm segmentation, I'll actually be coming back in a few weeks to talk about some techniques within Power BI to do that form of segmentation. So we'll talk about that more at the time. And then a few more. So finally, we've got basket analysis. So if any of you guys have subscriptions to, say, Netflix or YouTube or anything like that, then you often find that once you start watching particular kinds of content, maybe movies or TV shows, you'll typically get recommended similar kinds of movies and TV shows. And that's a form of, that recommendation is somewhat similar to basket analysis. So typically, all the data that's gathered by these organizations, they can work out that if you've consumed certain either media or even certain products, then they'll find that, okay, well, there's actually this group of customers that you might fit into that tend to also buy these kinds of things or watch this certain content. So based on what the group is collectively consuming, it's going to recommend or it's going to suggest that you may want to look at those items yourself. And that's how we get these more sophisticated recommendation engines. And that's how, by doing this kind of basket analysis, you can make sure that your customers are getting the kinds of offerings they're after. And then finally, we've got predictive analytics. So most of these techniques we've been looking at are somewhat based in either historical data or looking at current state, present data. Predictive analytics looks to the future state. So this may be proactively trying to work out when we think in the future a given customer is likely to churn and no longer come to us with their business. So then we may be able to use predictive analytics to work out when that's going to occur, and we can offer some interventions to avoid that from happening. Or we may even be able to predict what our customers are going to buy or how much they're going to buy from us. So we can aggregate that that prediction into a sales forecast to help us to understand the long-term health of our business. So for the purpose of today, we're mainly going to be focusing on cohort analysis, but we'll also touch on customer retention, churn, and spend analysis as well. All right, so we're about to get into it. So for a bit of context, we'll be working with a data set today from the UCI machine learning repository. So it's an open data set, and this data set is concerned with online retail transactions. So these are coming from a UK-based retailer, and this retailer, they tend to specialize in all occasion giftware. So they're going to have more activity around those kind of holiday periods. So many of the customers within this business, they're direct to consumer transactions, but there's also sales with wholesalers as well. So there'll be some differences within the kinds of customers that we have. And the data set that we're looking at covers about a 2-year period between 2009 and 2011. All right, so that's about it for the slides. Let's get into the actual report here. Okay, so to get us started, let's actually look at the data model that we're dealing with today. So we've got a pretty typical star schema here where we've got a central fact table, and this fact table has information about all the transactions that take place for this retailer. And this is down to the line item level. We've also got a couple of dimensions. So we've got our customer dimension, and it's mainly just got information about our customer IDs and when they started buying from us. And then we've got a standard date dimension, like calendar table here as well, that we can use. Now we've also got a few disconnected tables within our model, and these become quite useful once we start doing some interesting tricks with some of our visuals. So I'll walk through those as we come to them. So before we jump into our visual canvas page, let's actually have a look at this invoice details table. Okay, so if we jump to invoice details, here's what our data looks like. So as you can see, we've got one line per line item for each of our transactions. You can see that if we're looking at the invoice ID, there's some duplicates here. So this is referring to the fact that we have line items for each of these records. So for example, in this second and third row, we had one single transaction from our customers, from this particular customer, where they bought a black and a red umbrella, or they bought 3 of them. So here we're looking at, for each line item, the quantity and the price. We can see the customer that purchased them. We can see where they made that purchase, when they made the purchase. And then we've also got this column here, which shows the cohort. So again, as a reminder, a cohort is going to be the period in which the customer first made a purchase here. So this particular transaction took place on the 21st of May 2010, but the cohort for this customer is actually January of 2010. So January is when this customer first made a purchase from us, but then they've come back in May to make another purchase. So that's important information to keep in mind as well. All right, and what I might do is I'll jump to the report page. So that's on the tooltip. So here's our main report page, and this kind of covers these 3 key customer analytics techniques that we want to talk about today. So let's start with the one on the left-hand side. So here, this is our kind of conventional, our classic visual to look at doing cohort analysis. So along the rows of this pivot table here, we've got each of our cohorts. So remember, these are the groups of customers based on when they started buying from us. And then along the columns, we've got each of the months that they started buying from us. So this first month, this is the 0 months since they started buying from us. So this is the first month that they started buying from us. And then these following columns say how many customers stuck around for 1 additional month or 2 months after that first purchase, etc. And then at the moment, each of the cells of the pivot table in this heat map, these are showing how many customers stuck around for that month. So if we're looking at December 2009 as a cohort, this is saying that in that first month, we had 955 customers. But then 1 month following that, in January of 2010, of those customers, only 337 came back. And in the following month, 319 came back. You can see it's actually increased the following month in March. And that's because some of those customers who may have not made a purchase in January or February, they've come back in March. So we can see some patterns here as well. Now, within this heat map, at the moment, this is just showing the raw number of customers, but we can actually change this based on what measure we want to see. So now what we're looking at, actually, this is interesting. I've never actually seen this odd, this pink value that's showing up on the screen, but we'll just roll with it. That might have been my monitor. But anyway, so for the customers retained, this is looking at what's the percentage of the customers that stuck around from that first month, how many of them stuck around for the following months. So you can see here, this cohort in January 2010, all the first months are by default 100%, but then only 21% of them stuck around for the following month. And we can also look at the average spend for each of these customers. So we might want to see how much they spent on average per transaction and see if we can identify any trends here. So there's a few kind of hot spots here, which we can look at soon. So in terms of our other visuals, we've also got this in the top right-hand side, we've got a few visuals that speak to the customer retention and what's the breakdown of the types of customers that we have. So we've got 3 groups of customers. We've got our new customers, and this is telling us how many customers have never made a purchase from us before who are buying from us in this particular month. So again, this is broken down by each of the months in these years and how many total customers we have. So we've got new customers in the dark blue. In the kind of medium blue, we've got our returning customers. And the way we define returning customers is that these are customers who have previously bought from us in the past, who bought from us last month, and who are also buying from us this month as well. So they're returning from last month. And then finally, we've got recovered customers in the light blue. So a recovered customer is someone who has previously bought from us in however many months ago. They didn't buy from us last month, but then this month they've come back, they've been recovered to our customer base. So you can see that the overall trends here, we've got these kind of spikes that occur around November and then coming up again to November the following year. And that makes sense because we're talking about a retailer that deals in giftware. So it's probably ramping up towards the holiday periods. And on top of those main, this visual that shows the total number of customers, we can also see this as a proportionate breakdown. So we can see these represented as a percentage of the total customer base. So we can see in the earlier months in this data set, most of these customers are new, but then 12 months on, it's relatively stable between 10 to 15% new customers. Then we've got the returning customers here, and then these recovered customers sitting around 50% or so. Now, one of the things I might point out at this point is that these kinds of approaches around cohort analysis and customer retention, you usually want to make sure you've got a good history of your purchases from your customers. So in this particular data set, we've only got 2 years worth of transactions. So in reality, this business probably started well before December of 2009. But the thing is, a lot of those customers who, according to this data set, first started buying in 2009 in December, they would have realistically started buying in many earlier months than that, but we just don't have the data to represent it. So that's why in this first month in particular, it shows that it looks like we've got a very high number of new customers, whereas in reality, if we have the data for the earlier months, we would see this distributed, this 955 distributed across many other months as the first purchase there. And that's also why we've got this, this kind of darker band at the very top here. So that's one thing to bear in mind. If you're trying to draw real inferences from this kind of data, make sure that you're waiting till you get to sort of a steady state where you've got enough data in the history about your customers to know when they realistically started buying from you. And that's probably what we've got about this 12-month mark here with our data. Now, in the bottom right-hand side of this report page, we've also got some kind of spend analysis here. So we've got some fairly conventional visuals here around the total spend that the business is having in every single month, just in the bars of this column chart. But then we've also got for each month, what was the average spend per transaction? So what's interesting here, you can see that in November of 2010, that's where we had a high total spend, but then the average spend per transaction was about $450. And if you compare that to the following month, there was an overall lower total for the total spend, but then the average spend went up by about $200. So that could be worth exploring as to what's going on there. Maybe, you know, we've got some bigger customers that are coming back in that particular month, for example. And then we've also got this average monthly spend distribution visual. So this is essentially a histogram, which shows how many customers are buying in certain volumes in their average monthly spend. So we can see that we've got about 300 customers who spend between $0 and $100. We've got over 1,000 customers that spend between $1 and $200, same for $200 and $300. But then this distribution starts to wind down and trail off as you increase the average spend here. What's really important is, even though there's only about 50 customers that spend this much, that sum total, if you multiply that 50 customers by that $1,200 odd, that will potentially be a lot more than those 300 customers only spending about $50 to $100. So understanding where your customers fit in this distribution can be very useful to know who to focus your efforts on as well. Okay, so that's a bit of a broad overview about some of these visuals. What we can do is we can actually see what are the kinds of insights that we can pull from this information. So we can start by looking at this cohort analysis visual. So we can see again that we've got this heat map here, which paints a picture for us of how many customers are starting with us on a given month and how many are sticking around in subsequent months here. So you can see some interesting patterns here where we've got lots of new customers in this first year of the data set, but then fewer in the following year. And we can actually look at this, instead of just on the heat map, we might actually be able to look at this by slicing these values onto this here. And in fact, this works better when we're talking about the cohort level. So we can look in the individual cohort and we can see what's their spend distribution, what's their customer breakdown over time. So we can see the distribution there of whether they're a returning or a recovered customer. You can see that this cohort's fairly stable, around 50 to 55% of customers are returning from the following month. Then if we look at some other cohorts, so say this January cohort, we can see that we're getting a bit of a lower retention here. So we're only getting, you know, 40 to 50% of customers returning month on month. That can be some different behavior about our customers that we may want to drill into and understand what's different about customers who started in January 2010, where they offer different promotions, have they been continually offered those promotions, and should we be offering them some other offerings as we go on. So then we can also see that the number of new customers kind of ramps up towards the holiday periods, but then it drops off in December. And this is a bit clearer if we even look at this from the customer retained perspective. So now that's what the customer retained. We're looking at this from the percentage of customers that stuck around. And you can see that in, say, September of 2010, about 23% of customers came back, and then that same percentage came back for a second month. But then let's compare that to, say, December. So customers who first purchased in December of 2010, only 9% of those customers actually came back. So that's an interesting piece of analysis, and the most likely explanation for that would be that because this business deals mainly with all occasions giftware, it's probably a case that most customers are buying a lot of their giftware in advance of that holiday period in December, say around October, November. But then in December, you're not getting as many, first of all, you're not getting as many purchases to begin with, or many customers, new customers coming in. So we can see that by the fact that there's only 76 in December versus 375. But that percent retention's also gone down, probably because you have a lot of customers who are just desperately trying to get in while they can still make those purchases before the end of the year. And then they're probably not as likely to come back because they just needed that one purchase, and then they might take their business elsewhere. Maybe they just came to you because they needed something quickly rather than wanting to stick around in the long term. So that's what we find by having this kind of light banding here along this December cohort. But then we've also got this very clear kind of ridge of color in our heat map happening along this diagonal. So if we actually work out what month we're talking about, we can see that for this cohort from July 2010, we can see that we're talking about August, September, October, November. So we've got this kind of dark band around 30% for a few of these cohorts referring to November of 2010. But then once we get to December, there's a real drop off in retention. So there's probably some similar spend behavior going on where we're not having as many customers that interested in making purchases in December and onwards. So it may be that they just peak up in the holiday periods. And we can actually look across not just to 12 months out, we can go even further, and we can see that if we go out many more months than that, so say for July 2010, if we go 4 months out, we've got 29%, then it drops to 14. If we add another 12 months to look at the next calendar year, so we go to like 15 or 16, we can see that it's kind of ramping up a little bit as well. It's not as pronounced behavior. You'll probably get that more with some of these later cohorts that are more fresh to your business as well. And then what's really interesting is we can drill into this average spend here, so we can see how much these customers are buying from us each month. So if we look at, say, this cohort for September in 2010, and we can just select this and see what that's looking like, we can see that there was, in the spend analysis, there was a lot higher spend made in September of 2011, so this 12 months out peak, and we could already see that by the fact that we had this hotspot in the heat map. So maybe we want to understand what's going on there. So I can actually cross filter both these visuals. I'm going to select September of 2011, and I can see that there's actually a bit of a breakdown in the distribution where for the customers and their monthly spend, we can see that there's actually one customer who spent over $2,000. So it may be worth identifying that customer and working out why they're regularly coming to us, or why they've come to us in this case, to see if we can offer them anything else that's going to make them spend in those kinds of volumes again sometime soon. So that's some of the useful digging that you can do with these kinds of visuals. So it can be very powerful to identify your most important customers within your customer base. Okay, so we've kind of gone through how you can use these visuals. Maybe let's actually dive into the fun stuff and go into how we set up these visuals. So for this cohort analysis pivot table, what I've got is I've got a matrix visual here. And as far as the way we've defined this, I've got this cohort column from our data model, and this is actually being derived from the fact table rather than the customer dimension. So this is actually because it makes it easier to define our measures and not have to apply as much filtering, so the measures become a bit clearer. And then along the columns, we've got this months after first purchase field. And this is actually derived, if we look at our data model, this is actually based on this separate disconnected table, which I've called period out. And if we look at period out is just a list of values between 0 and, in this case, 23. So the 23 months that we could potentially go forward for our customers. And this is effectively a what if parameter. I haven't defined it as such, but it effectively acts as a what if parameter. So because it's not related to anything in the model, if we just added, say, an implicit measure into this pivot table, then we would actually find the exact same values represented along each of the columns here. So we've actually had to use some tricks in DAX to be able to allow this to provide some filtering into our measures here. So when we first start talking about our customers, let's dig into what our customers measure looks like and get familiar with that. So I'll make it a little bigger. Yeah. So the way I've defined the customers measure is I've got a few variables to stage this. So first of all, we calculate what's the cohort start month. And that's basically just what's the month that we're talking about in the row of the pivot table here. And then for the second variable, we've got this current month variable. And what this does is this works out based on what the cohort start month is and based on what the selected value of the column is. We want to work out how many months ahead we're referring to. So what the EO month function does is that works out the end of month for this date for the cohort when it's this number of months in the future. So for example, this cell I'm looking at here, this is for the August 2010 cohort, but because the column that I'm in refers to 2 months ahead of time, this is going to add 2 months to that, and then that's going to give us a current month of, instead of August, it'll be October of 2010. So then what we do in the main logic of it, we apply a calculate statement to work out the distinct number of customers, which is what we do with this count rows of the values, which is just the unique list of customers. We work out the distinct count of our customers, and then we filter that in the fact table based on what the current month is. So say in this particular cell here, we're already filtering our fact table down to just customers that first bought from us in June of 2010, but then we also want to filter that again down to the purchases that they made 2 months after that. So that's what this line in the calculate statement does. And that's how we can work out how many customers we have in each cell of this pivot table here. Now, if we jump to our second measure in the slicer at the top, we've got customers retained, which is our customers percent measure. So the way that's defined, that's a bit easier. We basically just take that original customers measure that we were just looking at, and we divide that by the total number of customers in that cohort. So we don't have to apply any additional filtering there. So it's just one divided by the other. Makes it a little easier to get that percentage that we were looking at. But then if we're talking about our average spend, this is where things get a little complicated. So I'll try and step through this as simply as I can. So we've got a few variables here, and some of these are actually some virtual tables. We've got our cohort start month and our current month that we initially defined just like in our customers measure. But then using those 2 month values, what we can actually do is we can work out what were all the transactions that we're concerned about for these customers. So we start with our main fact table, and then we filter that down to only include the transactions that occurred in the month that we're referring to in the column of the pivot table. So say we're looking at May of 2011 as a cohort. If we look at this second column, this is saying, I just want to know what were the transactions for customers who first bought in May, but then their purchases, what are their purchases in July of 2011? So that's what this transactions in cohort period table does. It just filters that fact table down to the records that we care about. And then from there, what we do is we roll that up to the individual invoices. So we use a summarize function to take this list of all of our transactions, and then we group that based on the invoice ID. So work out for each invoice, what was the total for that invoice? And we just use a SumX measure for that. So we take the values for our invoice details, and then we multiply the quantity by the price row by row to figure out what's the invoice total. So now this invoices table, this virtual table, just has a list of all of the invoices for the customers in the given cell of the pivot table, and then what was the invoice total for each of those invoices. And then from there, we just finally apply an average X function to iterate over that invoices table to work out what was the average total invoice. So what's important to take away from this as well is when we are referring to, by the actual name of the measure, the average spend, what we're referring to is the average spend per transaction, as opposed to the average spend per customer. So that can be an important differentiation as well. And then as far as setting up this visual, what I've actually got here is I've got a switch measure. And for those who haven't used a switch measure before, it's a very useful way to be able to change what measure you're actually looking at. This was kind of before calculation groups were available within Power BI. This was kind of the way that you would achieve some very similar functionality to that. I haven't actually gone around to upgrading this report to use calculation groups because this works just fine. But the way you set up this switch measure is just in the model, I've got another disconnected table, which I've called measure selection. And the way that that table is defined, it's just got a list of the values that I want to be presented in that slicer at the top there. So it on its own, because it's a disconnected table, it doesn't do any filtering on its own. But what we have is we have a measure that we use in the actual pivot table being this switch measure value. And then what switch measure does is it pretty much just picks up what's the value that we've got selected in the slicer there. And then based on what value selected, if we've got customers selected in the slicer, I want you to return the customers measure. If you've got customers retained, I want you to return customers percentage, but that needs to be formatted as a percentage. And then similarly with average spend. And then what's really useful that not everyone actually does this with their switch measures, but it's a very useful technique for error handling, is to actually add an error in case you don't have anything selected, or you have multiple selectors. So if I want to view both average spend and customers retained, so I've actually set up so you can't do that. But if I don't have anything selected, I can just temporarily delete this guy. If there's no measure selected, then it's going to return this error, and it's going to tell me to please select a single valid measure. So that's a useful little thing that you can add in as well. I'll just undo that now. Okay, so with this cohort analysis as well, one thing that I'll readily admit, especially when we're dealing with delivering these insights to different people across the organization. So what we can do is we can actually explain this a little better than just having these numbers on a page. So what's very useful for this is using the smart narratives feature that's come out in Power BI. So I've actually turned it off temporarily, but what I've got is a smart narrative tooltip that uses a custom tooltip page with a smart narrative to explain what's going on here. So if I select this visual, I can just scroll down to the tooltip, and I'm going to turn that on, and we can see how that's going to help us. So if I hover over a particular cell here, I'll just start out with these cells that are outside of the range of our data. So if I hover over one of these cells, I've actually got some logic set up that'll tell us, well, there's not really any sales data in June of 2012. So I might need you to select a period where we actually have data about the cohort spending habits. So that's a useful kind of error check there. And then we can look at the first month for some of our customers. So here we're looking at some of the details for our customers who first started buying from us in December of 2010. So it says in December of 2010, we had 76 new customers, and these customers spent $512 on average, which is 22.5% more than the average new customer spend of $418. And that's just for the first month there. So if we look at the subsequent months, we might want to compare how each cohort is going compared to that initial month. So if we're looking at, say, 4 months out, say for the July cohort, we can see that 4 months out, we're talking about November, and we can see that from the initial cohort of 186 customers who first bought from us in July of 2010, only 54 of them, or 29%, made a purchase later on in November of 2010. And then out of those remaining customers, they spent $336 on average in that month, which is about 20% less than the average customer in their fourth month. And they would usually spend about $419. So that can be some very useful insight to kind of paint a bit of a picture around what's going on with your cohorts. And this is especially useful for people who maybe don't see themselves as much as numbers people. So this is a very useful tool as well. So in order for me to set up this smart narrative, I've got this separate tooltip page, and I've just got 2 separate text boxes here, one of which just simply returns whatever month we've got selected in the pivot table according to the columns. But then this kind of paragraph text here, this is based on a custom measure that I've written. So if I go up to those custom measures, and I'll jump to this main page here so we can see this a bit better. What I can do is if I jump to Tooltip Text. So this is the full logic of it. It's a bit involved, but I'll kind of take you through the broad strokes of it first. So I've got a few if statements in here to weave us through the narrative. So first of all, we want to check if we're in one of those cells that is this period that we don't have any data about any customers that we have. So we basically say, if customers is blank, then please select a different month. And then we've got a few other variables that we can use for our narratives. So we've got different narratives based on whether we're referring to a new customer. So we're talking about that first column of the pivot table, or if we're talking about a returning customer here. And then towards the end, we basically just say, if the column that we're looking at is the first column, I want you to return the new customer description, otherwise the returning customer description. And then the way that I've got these defined is it's basically just written out as, you know, a bit of a narrative, just where you're filling in the blanks there. So whenever you're developing these kinds of narratives for your audiences, one bit of advice that I'll give is that I didn't just suddenly write this narrative word for word as it was. The first thing I did was I wrote down on paper what I want the narrative to broadly say, and then I would kind of iterate that in this measure. It probably took an hour and a half of iterating to get this just right as to what I wanted. So don't feel too intimidated to think that if you're building out your own custom narratives that you have to get it like this the exact first time. But the way this is structured basically says, If I make this a little, is it going to let me make it a little smaller? No, I want to be able to see the pivot table at the same time, but that's okay. So for our new customer description, we're saying that in the selected month, we had this many customers and we had this many new customers. They spent this much on average, according to the average spend measure. And then we've got this logic that compares their spend to the average spend. So I've got, first of all, this line that works out what was the difference in the spending of the customers in this month or in this cohort versus the other month. So that's what this variable at the top here does. It works out what the average spend is in the cell or the pivot table that we're talking about. And then the average spend by month tenure, that basically just works out the average across an entire column of the pivot table. So that's comparing it to that average across all cohorts. So in this logic, it just takes the absolute value of that spend difference, divides it by the average month tenure, and that gives us a percentage that we can work out. And then on top of that as well, this is also a very useful thing to do when you're building out these narratives, is instead of just saying the difference is, you know, plus 20%, for example, you usually want to make it more of a narrative rather than numbers based. So instead of saying it's plus 20% on the last month, we could say it's 20% more than the previous month, or more than the average for the cohort. So that's where I've got this this switch statement that says, look at the sign of the spend difference value. If it's positive, return the text more than. If it's negative, less than. If it's 0, I'm fine with more than. That'll work. And then we're just comparing that to the average new customer spend from the average spend by month's tenure measure. Now we've got some similar logic here for the returning customers. The first bit is fairly similar, but what I will kind of draw your attention to is we're using that same logic here of working out what the percentage difference is to the column total. But then we've also got this logic towards the end, which paints a clearer picture as to which month we're talking about. So if I look at the actual tooltip, we can see in the last paragraph, or in the last few lines, we're saying that the amount this cohort spent is 38% less than the average customer who spent $455 in their third month after their first purchase. So being able to write out that it was their third month rather than say month 3, like third month just flows a lot better. So you can actually use Power BI to determine what suffix to add to that. So if you're dealing with the first month, you want to add in the number 1, which is the period out value, and then append an ST to that. Second month, an ND, third RD, and then according to these rules, you'll just add these in, and if it's anything else, it will add a TH. So I've actually got a blog post around how you can set up this kind of logic in a more general sense, outside of just you know, the first few groups of dozens of numbers in the number line. So if you're interested in being able to set up this kind of thing for your Smart narratives in a more general sense, I've got a blog post that covers that, so you can jump onto the blog and have a look at that. So then finally, yeah, it'll just return the respective narrative based on which of these that we're looking at. So that's quite useful as well. Cool. So I think we're running short on time. What I might briefly do, I suppose, Michael, do we have any questions in the chat at this stage?
Yes, we do. So I know you. Yeah. Let me check the ones you've answered. Them. You've answered the one about. Okay, I think that was what you were trying to do about how to build these, the formulas you went into, but then 2 more questions came after that. Let me just read all the questions as we have, then you the ones you've answered. So the question number 1 was, how can we build this? I guess that was when you started showing the formulas and the structure. Then the question after that is, what visual tooltip did you use to achieve this dynamic analysis? So what visual tooltip did you get the question?
Kind of, like, I think so. I think the way that I set this up with this, I assume we're talking about the Smart Narrative Tooltip. So I've actually set up a custom tooltip page. So for those who don't know how to set that up, basically you would define a new page here And whenever you start up a new page, you can go to the format pane and you can tell Power BI that you want to use this page as a custom tooltip. And then once you set that up, it will allow you for any other visuals on any other page to say, if I want to have a custom tooltips, I can jump in, say for this visual, I can make, instead of the default tooltip, I can use a report page for that. So I might choose the smart narrative for this one. It's probably not going to make much sense here, but that's how you can define that in that regard. And then, yeah, for the smart narrative, that's where I've just used the smart narrative feature within Power BI. So you can just go into insert. I think in this case, you can just use a text box, and then it'll allow you to add in the logic just by clicking on the plus value, and then you can add in what you want to show there. So that's how you can build out that kind of thing.
Okay. The person who asked it, oh, Mr. Dapo, you're the one who asked. I don't know if that's because I think he asked it before you got to this part. So let me just go on. If that's not what he meant, he'll come back and mention. So another question from Dave. That can the practice file, can this file, can they get it? Can this file be made available so we can see how all this was built?
Yeah, of course. So I haven't currently got it available as public, just as I'm building up the additional visuals for the RFM talk we'll be doing in a few weeks. So I would say that once that content's ready, that's when I'll make the whole report available, and you guys can have a look through and get familiar with it at that point if that works.
Thanks a lot for that. I'm sure even those who. So we're going to do a replay. We are even lucky to get the numbers been fluctuating. It's not our usual time, so I guess not so many people were able to adjust email. So we're going to even do a replay at the normal time. I'm sure we'll get another set of audience. I'm sure both sets, because I'm happy with what you said. I'm sure those two will be happy that, yeah, I'll tell them ahead that you said you're going to give us by the time we do the second session. So another question. Okay, so it's tied to what you've even said that most likely you won't be able to go through all of this in today's session, and that there will be the other session which will happen in, I think, in 2 weeks or so's time. It's also going to be around this. So I think the person is asking that we need another class, which you've already made known that you will give us another class. He's saying that, you know, maybe you can build it from scratch. Is that going to be possible?
Oh, maybe, yeah. It sounds almost like I'd have to run a bit of a training session on this stuff because, yeah, it takes a little bit of time. Yeah, like I think one thing that I would recommend, rather than waiting around until I can get to the point of developing that, I actually base a lot of the calculations for this cohort analysis piece. There's actually a video by one of the Microsoft MVPs, Parker Stevens. He runs a YouTube channel called BI Elite, and he's got a video on doing easy cohort analysis. If you want to see how you can build out those kinds of visuals, I would definitely recommend checking out that video. And that takes you through in about 10 minutes how you can build out this kind of thing for yourself. So that might be a faster way to be able to learn about how to do that for yourself.
Okay. I think I would like to even share I'll go grab the link. The name of the, I didn't catch the name of I know you said the name is the MVP who you say did that video already, so I can quickly go grab the link of YouTube and share.
Yeah. So it's if on YouTube, it'll be the BI Elite YouTube channel. And I think the video is called something like Easy Cohort Analysis. It's coming out at some point in the last 12 months or so. Okay, I will do that while you continue. So there's the last question is, please, is there a tooltip visual to achieve? Okay, basically that's the one you answered earlier. Rather than building switch table, can we also code the switch values in our measure? Yeah. So I think I'm just looking at the chat now and having a read. Yeah. So I'm guessing this is more around defining this heat map here. So this is probably something that I didn't go through, and I'll quickly cover now. So as far as setting up the conditional formatting for this heat map here, one thing to note is when you're doing a switch measure, So when you're doing a switch measure, like so, where you're saying you're changing the formatting, so you're trying to say for the customer's retained, I want this to show as a percentage. The challenge is that this format measure, this format function actually means that it will render your measure as a text value. So you can, so if we've got that selected here, it's it's sometimes a text measure, a text value, sometimes just a whole number. So it's basically a whole number with that value category, those values for the percentage and the dollars appended on there. The challenge with that though is that you can't use conditional formatting in a conventional sense because you can't really base the color map on text value. So what you actually have to do is you have to set up a separate switch measure that has all the same values represented, but without that formatting here. And this has a different format value here. And that means that you can base the conditional formatting when you go, right click and conditional formatting. This background color is actually based on this second measure, which calculates this based on the raw values without actually appending those, like the percentage sign, for example. So that's somewhat useful with the background colors. Now, I think just looking at the question as well that's in the chat, it looks like it's asking if you can actually hard code the colors. And from my experience, yeah, typically you can. So instead of returning an actual number here, you can get it to return a hex code for your values. What's really useful about doing it that way is that actually allows you to also set a transparent hex code. So you can say, based on a particular value, you might want the cell to come up as transparent. So the only way that I'm aware of to do that is to actually have a measure that's somewhat similar to what's in the chat there as well, if you're hard coding the actual hex values and then saying to return that. So that's a good question.
Okay. So I think those are the questions for now. Thanks a lot. I've also pasted I grabbed the link for the using cohort analysis video, so I've pasted it in the chat. Thanks for that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, great. So I suppose for these other visuals as well, I can probably.
Sorry, I'm going to miss the. I think it's some not well. So carry on.
Yeah. So just given the time for all these other visuals, I'm happy to kind of go through these at the next session, in addition to going through the RFM segmentation piece, just to respect everyone's time. But yeah, I think were those the only questions, Michael? Were there any others?
Okay, so let me just first ask from the participants any questions you have. Are there any questions you would like Sam to answer before we end the session? Okay, I'm looking for some specific people who I know typically use Power BI a lot. Let's see. Okay, Mr. Diaz asked some questions. Mr. Tunde, I know you're a regular participant. Any question? Okay, great. How long? So someone has asked the question, saying, how long did it take you to build this?
Yeah, good question. I would say this report I probably did over the course of a number of weekends here and there. So I had to work out the number of hours to get to this point, probably 2 to 3 solid days. Because of course, this is mainly just talking about all the visuals, but there was a bit of iteration to work out, what are the best visuals to use? How do we make sure the data's modeled in the right way? So there's always, like with most Power BI reports, there's a bit of iteration that goes on here, but actually the time that it took to put together is probably in that kind of ballpark. That's a good question.
Okay. All right. So just to again announce to everyone, so Sam has agreed, and even before now has been generous enough to say he's going to do for us another session, another part of this. And he said it's going to be focused on the RFM, the recency, frequency, and monetization aspect of the whole cohort analysis. But then from some of what you said, he said, okay, maybe we'll try and also squeeze in some of what you wanted him to do today also there. But more importantly, he's going to be here on the, let me quickly grab my other screen, share. Okay. It's going to be on the 6th. Let me just be sure if it's 16 or 23. Okay, so it's on the 16th. On the 16th of May, we're going to have him again. And I also need to let you know that a lot of what he has said about tools he used, he also has written about them in his blog. So for those of us who also we like to be able to redo all of these, and as a way for you to start even understanding what you are seeing, I'm going to share his blog. It's been a very rich trove of resource for me. I think I've come across it even before knowing him, then now getting to know the person behind the blog. So it's I'm sharing that right now. You should subscribe. You should check out all the things that are valuable for you being able to apply those concepts is deployed here. You know, being able to understand how they even work. You know, at your own pace. Okay. How are we getting it? So someone again is asking. Yes, he said, but that the practice file will come when he's done. He's still working out the part that he's going to show us in 2 weeks' time. So he's agreed that once he's done with that, he will share with us. Okay, so it's been a very huge pleasure on our side and an honor to have you, especially considering that it's really night for you there. So we've come to the part where we're always very eager to hear what has been your journey, you know, your journey to here from, I don't know how far back you took interest in data analysis. Can you share with us your unique journey so we get to see?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I suppose my journey is a little bit different to most people's. So I actually went down a few kind of paths before I landed in the Power BI area. So my initial kind of career trajectory was more going towards the scientific research path. So I actually started doing a PhD in physics of all things, and I was doing a lot with data and kind of data science kind of things in that space. I found it wasn't quite my cup of tea because you weren't really working with people very much. So I stuck with that for maybe a year and a half. And then after that, I kind of found, well, you know, I would prefer to be dealing with people. What I ended up doing was, at the time, I was doing a lot of teaching at the university as well. So I ended up doing more of a kind of schools outreach role in education. So it's kind of very far away from data for a few years. And that's where I learned a lot of the skills that helped me with running a lot of training sessions and presentations. But of course, the challenge was that there wasn't enough data involved in that either. So it was kind of like what I ended up doing was I found a nice happy medium jumping into Power BI initially as a consultant after having worked in education. And so sometimes it takes a while, just kind of like the old fairy tale Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where you got to try something that's, you know, not quite what you're after, and then you've gone too far, and then you find something in the middle that's just right. So my journey kind of ended up being a bit meandering to get there. But yeah, I ended up starting out as a Power BI consultant after doing a bit more formal training around databases and data science. And then I worked with a number of different clients for a few years within that area. But I found the thing that really kept me going and has kept me down this path of working with Power BI is that I think it's actually kind of fun. Like I spend my weekends actually doing this kind of stuff that I would usually expect to be paid to be doing. But once you can find something that you would basically do for free, then you know you found something that you really enjoy. So I would kind of paint that picture of my journey.
So I think there are two aspects of your journey that I'm really even interested in hearing a bit more. One is, that's interesting to you. It seems you even started the PhD, or was it like you were already putting in the application and then you decided to not go further with it, or you had even started and then or you had finished and you know, I want to know why did you decide I would rather do the data analysis, I would rather do this a bit more customer-facing kinds of use of data and all, rather than because from your profile you are also already doing research, which also involves data. So I'm really interested in why.
Yeah. So I think it wasn't a snap decision to go from A to B to work out exactly what I was doing. Like, it took a few kind of years to reach that point. I think, you know, I'd always been a bit of a numbers person. So I'd ended up studying science and going into doing research within the field of physics in particular. The challenging thing was when you go into research, the kind of research that I was doing, it was mainly working in a research lab with no windows, barely any human contact, machines whirring all the time, and everything was broken half the time anyway. So it wasn't exactly an encouraging environment. And usually, you know, you want to be working with people as well to learn from and to teach, and not be kind of in a room that would very much, you know, probably sounds, in my mind, the lab that I was in kind of promotes the kind of same thinking that I'm sure Jack Nicholson was thinking in The Shining that led into that. So I'm glad I didn't stick around and become Jack Nicholson. But yeah, like, I think I was in that environment for quite a while, and I found, look, it wasn't really working for me. And that's where I tried something new and going into that education space. And then once I worked out that that wasn't quite right either, that's when I eventually worked back more towards a middle ground of working both with data, but also with people as well, to kind of, you know, help people out in that regard.
That's good to know. So we've come to, I've also shared your LinkedIn, and so I noticed you shared it in your about page. I'm like, okay, that would be nice for me to also share to people here. So you can connect with Sam. There's LinkedIn. It's already in the chat box, and it's also active on Twitter. Your email is also on your about page, but I don't know. I wanted your permission first, if you would be okay.
Well, I would say more like LinkedIn and Twitter is a bit better. I would say for more practical reasons, probably to avoid email, because I found that unfortunately my email filter doesn't like receiving things from Nigeria. Tends to send it to spam. So if you want to make sure that I get message, just the other platforms.
Okay, great. So the last one is, we would like to hear your own advice for people starting out right now. So people who are new to this space, how can they get to this level of in fact, how can they become a Power BI guru?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Like, I think, well, as I was saying before, when it's like you're doing something that you love, I think you've got to really, I guess, develop a passion for it. The starting point for that, I find, is when you're dealing with a lot of the technical elements, it can be really hard to think, this is too hard, I give up, I'm going to do something else. But I think if instead you try and approach it from a more curious perspective and thinking, instead of thinking, this isn't working, this is annoying, I quit, instead thinking it from, this isn't working, I wonder why, I'll figure it out eventually. Like, taking that more positive growth mindset attitude, that can be really valuable to ensuring that you get to that point. But then also going through a lot of the resources that are out there in the community. So like that, the YouTube channel from BI Elite, even YouTube channels like SQL BI, Kerbal.com, Sky in a Cube, various different YouTube channels are quite good. There's also a number of different books that are quite useful. So especially the books by Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari from SQL BI. They're very useful for really understanding what's going on under the hood with DAX in particular, and how to set up your data models. So I would definitely recommend going through those kinds of resources. And yeah, I guess building a bit of a passion as well. One thing that I would definitely recommend if you're getting started in the space, I do see a lot of people getting started in this space where they'll often try to demonstrate their skills by building a CV in Power BI. I would actually very much recommend against doing that. A lot of people do that, but the challenging thing is with a CV is more kind of qualitative, descriptive information, and Power BI is more built for number crunching. And I've seen many different CVs based on that are built in Power BI. I've never been impressed by many of them. So I think I wouldn't bother wasting your time. I would say if you're going to build anything to demonstrate your skills, build like some portfolio items like we're looking at here, because that's going to speak a lot more highly than, you know, Power BI based CV. At least that's my perspective, at least.
Yeah, So I know a lot of some of what you said. Also part of what you've even demonstrated, and I know you mentioned SQL BI, Guy in a Cube, and many others. I'll also mention too that also in addition, do check out Apex Insights. Make sure you read out the post there. And the other question I had that I said questions, which I asked you why you switched from academia to these. The other part was, how did you start Apex Insights? What was the motivation to keep churning out those high quality content? And your blog is one of a kind in terms of it's just focused on content. I couldn't find adverts. I didn't see any other kinds of things people put on theirs. Yours was purely showing that this person genuinely wanted to share this knowledge and putting in all the hours and all. So why? What's been the secret behind that continuous knowledge sharing for free?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So I think so certainly within Melbourne, I'm quite active in the kind of local Power BI community, and some of my friends, some of my contacts there who are actually also Microsoft MVPs. I've worked with them in the past, and they were very much encouraging me to start blogging and writing content, because there was a lot that I was actually teaching them. But it took me quite a while to kind of build up to the point where I was actually ready to start writing content, more because you've got to build up a website and do all that stuff. And I was kind of putting up my own barriers, kind of making excuses for myself. But if that's the kind of thing that you're looking to do, you've kind of just got to, suspend that voice in your head that talks yourself out of it, and just say, oh, just give it a go. And if it doesn't work, it's okay. And I think for me, I view it as a really nice outlet to kind of experiment and try different things. So I'm a very kind of curious person. So, oftentimes I'll just come up with ideas just out of the blue for things of like, oh, this would be cool. I wonder if Power BI can do this. And then I might just make a note of it. And then later on, I might try and build out something as a bit of a case study to see if it can be done. And then I think, oh, this will be great. I can actually maybe write a blog post about this to kind of explain this to everyone, so that other people can learn from it as well. So I guess that's the kind of inspiration, is that, I very much like to share my knowledge and try to teach others with it. And also I've always got plenty of ideas to try and think of, oh, this would be a cool little application as well. So it actually makes kind of blogging somewhat fun as well, because it's just sparking a bit of curiosity there. So I think, yeah, that's probably how I'd put it.
Great. So thank you very much. And we're happy that you've even been able to give us beyond the 1 hour. So thank you. And we are going to be wrapping the session right here. So everyone, thank you for being part of today's session. If you missed a large chunk of the session and you're okay with rewatching when we do at our normal 6 p.m., then great, join again 6 p.m. And if you think you won't be chanced, we recorded the entire session. So by tomorrow, you'll be able to have it on YouTube and be able to watch. So Sam, it's been a pleasure. We look forward to May 16th, to the second part of this session. And we are very, very grateful. Thanks a lot, and have a nice week ahead. We know it's night for you, so good night. Have a nice night. So bye.
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, and yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to have been invited. So thanks very much.